we're on. So I should put back into our slide mode. And density is just the number of ties in the network. Because we might sometimes compare networks of different sizes, it makes sense to divide the number of ties by the number possible. Because in a bigger network, there are more people that could be tied. Unfortunately, that normalization really doesn't work very well. This two networks here have the exact same number of nodes. And so your visual interpretation is accurate. The one on the right is more dense. Although, if you look at it, it's only 0.25 versus 0.15, but it looks quite a bit more dense. The reason the normalization doesn't work is that what you normalize by is the number of pairs of nodes. So, for example, a typical normalization for a non-reflexive graph, that is one in which you don't have ties to yourself, and if it's undirected, is going to be dividing by n times n minus 1 divided by 2. So that's an n squared thing there. So if you just increase the size of the network a little bit because of that n squared, you really make the denominator huge. And so density tends to go down with as the networks go up. So it's not a great measure unless you've got networks that are pretty much the same number of nodes. Okay? I wanted to make sure that you understood that from a computational point of view, density is just the average value of the entire network. No for the diagonals. Getting rid of the diagonals. It's also the same thing as if you look at the row marginals and the column marginals, those are degree normalized, so divided by the number of people you could be connected to. And if you average all the degrees, if you average the average degrees, you get, again, density. It's very convenient. And in our second week, we talked about an example of density where we showed a northern Thai village, and then I showed another one, and we talked about helping Thais and how the more dense one, where there was more help with the harvest, might be the one to survive shocks. So that's a possible interpretation. Density of truss ties might have all kinds of implications, as they did for Julia's talk last Friday. There's also a thing called density tables. Density tables are mostly used with a priori groups. And what you do is say you've got a network like this that's got two groups. You've got red people and blue people. And you're interested in the number of ties within and between each group. So from women to women, there are 20 ties. From women to men, there are only 4 ties. From men to women, there are 5 ties. And from men to men, there are 25. So this tells you right away that there's something like homophily going on. Women prefer women, men prefer men. Very little cross-gender connection here. Now, of course, the number of men and women is not identical. So we typically divide by the number possible. And that's what we call density here. So this number, 0.357, corresponds to the 20, and it's 20 divided by the number of women times the number of women minus 1 divided by 2. So in other words, 36% of all pairs of women actually have a tie. And 28% of all men are actually tied to each other. So it actually reverses the raw numbers, and that's because there are more men than there are women in this network. So we use these density tables. Often, instead of gender, which is pretty simple, we would have departments here of an organization, and we're interested in to what extent radiology is talking to, whatever else. It's the only term I can think of. It's medical. Or it might be marketing talking to engineering and talking to finance, talking to quality control, and so on. And it might be, in fact, that there are certain standards that manufacturing companies adhere to that require certain patterns of communication, like in an ISO 9000 setting, everybody has to talk to quality control from time to time. And you can then use network analysis to see, is that true? Has everybody got ties to quality control? You evaluate the extent to which they're essentially conforming to a standard. So just this part now, I think I'm going to show you how to do in the computer. So I'm going to close that. Let's take out our UCI nets, dust them off. There it is. Very slow and very problematic. Wow, I have no idea. This is worse. You know, I'm going to Guatemala next week, and I just read the U.S. State Department's travel advisory. It says don't go. Literally, it says reconsider going. There's over 100 murders a week, and they particularly target foreigners. And I'm like, this doesn't sound like a vacation anymore. And working with this thing, it feels like something's going to go wrong any second now.
No. Because I'm there.
Oh, you did that. I remember.
I can do it.
I forgot. Always blame Jimmy Al first. That is a rule. Guatemala City to start with, then Antigua, then Atitlan. Yeah.
A year ago.
How'd you get from place to place? I had an armored vehicle. But like say, Antigua to Atitlan is 3-hour drive. Pleasure. I'm a sadomasochist. A pleasure, yes. Oh. What about callejeros and, like, I hear about the one car gets up behind you, one car gets up in front of you, they force you off. Nobody cares, there's no police.
Sounds like fun.
Let's talk later. Okay, here we are, safe in UCINet, where I prefer to stay. I could spend a whole vacation inside of UCINet. And I grew up in, I spent my teen years in Guatemala. So 40 years ago, I knew Guatemala well. Let's go to network cohesion, because density is about cohesion. And find density under there. It's tricky. You have to go left just right. And then you pick density. And then it gives you a lot of options. Density overall, that's good if you just want to know what is the density of this network. It's 0.24. Or we could do density by groups. I'm going to do density by groups. The network data set that I'm going to use is, I showed you this example, so we use CapNet. And then the data set containing a row partition wants to know, okay, what's a characteristic of the nodes that I can use to see whether there's ties between these different categories? So this might be department or something. So I have a data set called ATTR. And if you look to the right, you see that there's gender, there's role, and between this. Not much pickings here, but let's pick gender. And then we'll say, okay. And then an hour later, things happen. It reorganizes your network according to gender. Now, actually, this network always was ordered by gender, but if you hadn't been, you would see a visual pattern here that shows that there's kind of it's actually more like a core-periphery structure in a way, that where there's a group of women that are pretty tightly connected, and they're not very connected to the periphery in either way. But actually, it's not a core-periphery structure because the men are also pretty well connected to each other. So it's merely more like a two-group structure. The numerics of that are what I showed you before. There's 20 ties in the first block. There's just 4 ties, 1, 2, 3, 4 in the second block. There's 5 in here, and there's 25 in here. Oh. The arrows don't go in the same place on my computers on there. Sorry. So then it also has the density. So there's the density of 0.357, which corresponds to 20 ties. And it's really just the average of this block here, the average of all the ones and zeros. And if you had valued data, it would just be the average strength of tie. And just for convenience, this is just inside each group. Group 1 had 20 ties for a density of 0.357. Group 2 had 25 ties for a density of 0.278. Okay? So if you wanted to know which departments are more cohesive in this college, for example, we could look at co-authorships. We might find that the management department is very cohesive because there's a lot of people writing papers with each other, but finance isn't so cohesive. Okay, I did want to show you the density overall. So network cohesion density overall. And the data set that we're going to put in here is I'm going to put in Kaptail. So it's Kaptail. I think the screen is much smaller than normal. And this is a network that has multiple relations in it. So if we run it, it tells us for each of the 4 relations it found inside this data set, it says, here's the density of each network, here's the number of ties, here's the standard deviation, which is only really useful if there were valued data, the average degree, which actually is very much like density, but more helpful. So it's just, for this network, on average, how many people do people know? And in the first one, S1, the average is about 8. The second one, S2, people know more people. On average, they know 11 other people. And then in the last 2, on average, it's like 3 or 4, so they know quite a bit fewer. The absolute value of these, how many people do you know, or the absolute value of density is kind of irrelevant. There's no rule of thumb that says, oh, your density is under 0.3, that's low. The only way to use it is comparatively against other data, right? Ideally, you'd have some data set, for example, in management that had maybe 27 different manufacturing companies. And then for a new client, you could calculate their density and say, compared to the other 27 benchmark ones, you're higher than the average, or you're lower. That could be useful.
So the relations would be stuff like friendship or advice.
That's right, exactly. And in this particular case, I don't know what they are, but since we'll use this data set later, I better find out. Tailor shop, Kaptail. Observed interactions at tailor shop in Zambia for 9 months or 10 months. That's when people collected real data. They sat in a place for 10 months and collected data. No mechanical Turk. I got the data yesterday, in 1 hour. His focus was changing patterns of alliance among the workers, doing extended negotiations for higher wages. 2 different kinds of interactions recorded at 2 different times, 7 months apart over a period of 1 month. T1, T2, these are the instrumental ties, work and assistance related, and S1 and S2 are the associational friendship ties. So going back to our actual results, let me close this. I've lost the output, but sometimes this works. You can go to File, so you can't see my arrow. You can go to File and choose Previous Output and choose Density. There we are. And we can see that the density for the instrumental ties is much lower than the friendship ties, which you may or may not have expected. I guess I would have thought the opposite. Okay. Questions? Right. There's also another part of the program. I don't want to confuse you with too many different things, but I thought you should know that my hands were here. I didn't do that. But there's another part of the program where you can run the exact same thing. You can give it the same network and the same partition into different categories. It tells you the number of ties between each group, but then it also gives you the expected number under the model of independence. And that means, well, how many ties would you expect from a woman to a woman, assuming that people were not choosing based on sex at all? They didn't know the sex of the person they were choosing. And it turns out, and then there's a significance test for this. And these are all valid ones in the sense that we're not making any assumptions about chi-square distributions or anything that you might find in Stata or SPSS. This is all done via permutation tests, which we discuss in 3 weeks. So these are valid tests. And so this says it's very significant. It's a big chi-square value. The observed pattern is too different from what you'd expect by chance. It's not actually, no, it's a quap. Yeah. I did not press the button. Maybe, but how? Why? And notice that the biggest numbers are the bottom row, and that's because the 2s are the men. There's more 2s in general, so the raw expectation is that there will be more numbers down here. I think what's happening is that when I put the cursor over it, it moves the cursor on the screen off to the left of the screen, and then it calls in another, I don't know what. Yeah. Anyway. So average degree is often better. It's interesting to look at these two networks here. It seems pretty clear to everyone that the one on the bottom has greater density, but it actually has much less density. Much less. What's happening? The eye cannot realize how many pairs of nodes are actually not being connected. There are more nodes in it, and you just can't see it. The average degree is exactly 4. So every single node in both networks is connected to exactly 4 others. So to me, the average degree measure is a better measure of the cohesiveness of the network than density. Reciprocity. Well, reciprocity is just how often directed ties are reciprocated. So this particular directed tie here, maybe it's friendship nominations, is reciprocated, which is nice. A likes B, and B says that they like A. Reciprocation. So we can ask, though, in general, how often, when somebody sends a tie, do they receive a tie from that same person? And that's what's called arc reciprocity. And that's usually the one that people are interested in. So in this data set, CampNet, it's 0.704. About 70% of the time that somebody sends a tie, they actually get a tie back. There's another way of looking at it, which is to simply count up all possible dyads and classify the dyads as being one kind or another. If you could do kind of an inventory of all dyads, you'd find that there was a dyad that involved A and B. And you wouldn't care about the direction, but you'd notice that it could be like that. That's one kind of dyad. It could have been like this. That's another kind of dyad. Or it could have been like this. No tie in either one. So it's not counting that a tie that looks like this is different from this. Because it looks, we've got asymmetric ties that can look like this. There's asym, there's sim, and there's null. And then what proportion of all the kinds of dyads are of the sim type? That's what the other thing was doing. The dyadic reciprocity was doing. Anyway, both are measures of the extent to which ties are being reciprocated. And as long as you stick to one measure, everything's fine. You don't have to choose, you can choose either one. Just stick to it. Yeah. And there's actually a little, if you run this in UCINet, it points you to a web page that discusses the ins and outs of it. So, reciprocity. Then there's transitivity. And transitivity has featured very largely in network analysis in the recent past, thanks to Granovetter and then Burt. I almost think it's the only concept that people care about anymore. In an undirected network, transitivity is just a property that if A has a tie to B and B has a tie to C, then A must have a tie to C. If it's directed, then A has a tie to B and B has a tie to C, then, and the direction is important here, A has a tie to C. That's transitivity. If it had been the other way around, A to B, and then we've got B to C, and C to A, that's not transitivity. That's a cycle. That's a circle. What goes around comes around. Right? So this is more like if A can beat B in racquetball and B can beat C in racquetball, you kind of expect A to be able to beat C. And this kind of transitivity is a sign of hierarchy. You can see this, but it wouldn't have gone there. So if you have a perfect hierarchy, some kind of relation, maybe which deer can beat which other deer in a headbutting contest, it should be entire, it should be like 100%. And it would extend further down the line too. So there's another one down here. Well, then C can beat D. Well, then that should mean that actually B should be able to beat D, and A should beat D as well. And of course, with transitivity is also the issue of how to count it. For example, is this 3 examples of transitivity? Because there's the ABC one, then there's also the BCA one, and then there's the CAB one. You count it 3 times, you just count it once. People do it different ways. When you count it 3 times, it's the method of triplet. And that method is easier computationally and in terms of creating other statistics with the Penn diet. And the other way is the way of triad. Triad is like dyad. You don't consider the order. You don't consider the, you don't reuse the same nodes. So that perhaps will make more sense in a moment, but not quite yet. First we have to do this slide. There is another concept out there that's very popular, or was very popular, called the clustering coefficient. You're familiar with the degrees of separation stuff? Anybody not familiar with the 6 degrees of separation? no one is not familiar with, so everybody is. So, part of the interest of that was that it was surprising that you could reach a stockbroker in Boston from a person in a randomly chosen Nebraska in just, on average, in 5 links, 5.5 links. So, and what's surprising about that is that human networks tend to be highly clustered. They tend to look like this. And, you know, with a few ties in between them and so on. And the thing about clustering is that it tends to provoke long paths. Long paths. So the puzzle was, how can it be that you could have human networks that are highly clustered and yet have short paths? The human networks also tend to have short paths. 5 links all the way to the bottom, 6 links in Russia. And you know, very famous article in 1998 by Watson Strogatz. Came up with the answer, solution. And they said human networks have a very interesting property, which is that they have random ties that connect them, and just enough random ties that connect them across different clusters. And they prove mathematically, in relation, that it only takes a very small number of just random ties to severely shorten the path to the And they made a name for that. They said, human beings live in a small world. Small world. And a small world has 2 pieces. Small world is clumpy, and it has short distance. And this was seen as kind of like in the space of all possible graph networks, that there's a very small proportion of those that actually have both of those properties. They're antagonists. And human beings live in that sweet spot, ones that have both of these. And this is probably some major adaptation, something really important for understanding human beings. Random ties. Oh, I see. Yeah, it's if you do throw a random tie into the network, it's all clumpy, by chance alone, it has a strong tendency to go across. So, if you're following these, most networks are produced by a series of processes like homology. I seek out people for my gender, my race, my age, my profession, things like that. And so it's hard to actually meet people who are completely different. But by chance alone, you know, so you sit next to somebody in a bus and you meet them, suddenly you're connected to somebody that's totally different type of person. So those random ones have a high probability of crossing, whereas non-random ones have a strong tendency to keep you locked into your world. So everybody went out looking for small worlds. And the way we define small worlds is that it has to be clumpy and it's got to be short distance. How do you measure clumpiness? You can measure clumpiness by the number of closed triads. Another way of saying transitivity. They called it, well, the physicists called it a clustering coefficient. And it became very famous, heavily cited. It wasn't until the social scientists started reading the physics literature that they realized that this is what they had been calling transitivity since back in the 30s. And, but of course, people who really wanted to do the latest thing, they wanted the clustering coefficient. In UCINet, I had to finally create a new button called clustering coefficient that just called the transitivity program. Because people wanted to hear that new name.
You said triads, not triplets.
Yeah, so there's triads. There's actually 2 versions of it, and let's just go through it. The clustering coefficient starts by looking at something at the individual level. It looks at a person and all the people who are directly connected to them, and then the ties among those people. So this is the ego network. And it measures the density of that ego network. And you get a score for each person. Then you average up the densities for each of the people, and that gives you the overall network level clustering coefficient. Actually, there's a variation on it, which is that you weight each node, when you're averaging, you weight each node by the number of pairs of persons in the network, and that's the one that actually matches our triadic measure of transitivity. Yeah. Actually, let's do this. Yeah, so I would say, this is a network, as we define it as that. It has a certain structure. If you pick a set of nodes within it, it's a network. And it has a certain structure. So you get down to one node, it's always a network. Yes, that's true. We'll make a slight exception when we talk about core-periphery structures, which basically I think of as a network that only has one subgroup. But normally, it makes no sense to talk about subgroups unless it's more than one. So this measure here so the clumpiness here is measured by the clustering coefficient, CC. And what people have devised, and let's see if I've got, go on. Can the screen blacks out at this moment. I'm going out for a beer. Sorry? Well, I like country boy beer, but I don't like local place. So.
They have dogs though.
Okay.
I can hit the button when you want.
Okay, thanks. That's the button.
I did. Is that what you want?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. I can make do with any size. So, yes. So, in order to determine whether a network is a small world network, what people do is they measure the clustering coefficient, that's a QC. They also measure the average distance between every pair of points. So from here to here is a 2, from here to here is a 1, 2, so on, so it's the average shortest path. And they compute this ratio, which is the clustering coefficient of your actual network divided by the clustering coefficient of a random network, divided by the typical path length, that's what the L is, of your network, divided by the path length of a random network. And when that ratio is high, it means that your network has this property of being short path, but highly clustered. And there's a routine in BCI called small world. So perhaps I should prove that. Already at 2,000 steps, this class is really good for me. All right, so we drop out of warp here and go into UCINet. And I think the only place that we find this is in the CLI, the command line interface. So choose the command line interface and then type something like DSP small world. I can't remember whether it really wants directed or undirected data. But anyway, it gives you an index, 2.85. It's an index that is bounded between 0 and infinity, and 1 is kind of the fulcrum point of like, it's neither one or the other. Because it's a ratio of one thing to another. So this is saying, ratio, this is like almost 3 times what you'd expect in a kind of neutral network. So this is a small world. There's no inferential statistic, though, that says, yes, it is p-value of whatever. So I would say that the importance of small world is mostly that it's in the literature and you'll run into it, but I do not see the point of it, frankly. I just don't find it very interesting. A lot of papers that have used it have basically used it descriptively. They said, oh, look, another network that is small world. That really proves that it's like some kind of universal. It's a universal law. But you need more than that. I think it's probably, I think I've seen the rule of thumb of 3. So you might just Google that, see what the variance on that is. Given that small worldness hinges on the clustering coefficient, which in turn hinges on the number of transitive triads. Oh, I forgot to mention something. Why would the number of transitive triads have anything to do with how funky the network is? I never really figured out what the connection is. The answer, is that if you've got a cluster, and then back over here, and back over here, you get connected. That within a cluster, there are a lot of transitive triads. Look at this one here. A, B, C, D. A, B, D is a transitive triad. B, C, D is a transitive triad. A, C, D is a transitive triad. A, B, C is a transitive triad. There's a lot of transitive triads. So whenever you have a clump, it necessarily comes with a lot of transitive triads. Now, you could have more sophisticated clumps that actually don't have it. But at a macro scale, clearly more connected to the rest, so on and so forth. But the unfortunate thing is that while company networks do tend to have high clustering coefficients, there are other structural forms that also have high clustering coefficients. So it's kind of necessary but not sufficient.
How do you calculate there are so many nodes, and this is all connected with each other. Some are connected, some are not connected by the node of time.
So we simply count up loosely, we count up the number of transitive triples and divide that by how many there could be. Yeah. So here's an example of a non-transitive triad. Here to here to here, we're missing that line. But there was a potential for it, because the 2 arms were there. On the other hand, if you've got something like this, and you've got that, from here to here, that's not intransitive. It's not transitive and it's not intransitive. Because there's no possibility. If you had that, then there's a possibility for it. And that's kind of what we're seeing here. A more general approach to all this is the triad census. The triad census for directed graphs where you work out all possible subgraphs of size 3. Every possible. The one at the top is the one with no hypertension. That's the most common. Look here at CAPNet. That one, called the 003, is 245. The way these are labeled is called the MAN convention. It's the number of mutuals, the number of asymmetrics, and the number of nulls. So this is an asymmetric. That's a null. And there's a symmetric, a mutual. Here's a mutual right there. That's got only Or you could have 012, it's got 0 mutual, it's got 1 asymmetric, which is right there, and then it's got 2 null, one there and one there. So we could break it down into 16 possible different triads, and we can count them up. And the profile that a network has is a distinctive signature of that network. Like some networks have a completely different profile across the exact same triad. You can tell them apart from each other. You can use them diagnostically, for example. You could be given 50 networks, nobody tells you what they are, and you can calculate this and say, okay, I can see that this 7, they're all probably the same group or the same thing. The other come from entirely different groups. And some of them are transitive. Let me show you a little way to do transitive. This one's transitive because you go from here to the left to the right, and the right one to the top one, and then the left one is connected to that top one. This one, he works the same way, and I can go from the left to the right, all the way to the top, or I then go straight that way. I can work the other way too. Now, this one is transitive because I can go from the top over to the right, over to the left, and then from the top straight to the left. It just has asymmetry, that's right, yeah. If you're trying to figure out transitivity, it doesn't matter about that. But overall, you can have triads from at any time. They're still triads. So, how do you know that? So what we do is we actually, we have the network in front of us, and we do all possible combinations of 3. We say, Mary, Bill, or Steve. What are the types of numbers? Oh no, none. Count 1 up for this. So you have to collect the network data, and then you compute these. So these are the transitive ones here. There are some that are intransitive, and there are some that are simply not relevant to transitivity. Let's see if I can make this go. All right. So these are data that I didn't collect. They're the alignment collected. It's an ecosystem. The nodes are species, and it's who eats who. And it's a marine ecosystem. So it's fish and those kinds of things that are eating each other. And here I've got the triad types, and I counted them for all the species in 4 separate seasons. And you can see that certain ones change over time, right? So let's see. Is there a clear pattern here? Well, it seems like these two, the 012 pattern, they're bigger in spring and summer, and they're smaller in winter. Almost everything is smaller in winter, except for null. There, it's the highest in winter. This pattern is kind of the reverse of that. Let's see, what else have we got? It's not telling me an easy story. I can just tell it's different. And it looks to me like in general, winter is more different from all the others. But I want to maybe correlate the columns with this, to see which seasons are more similar to each other. And I think maybe I have a slide on that. Yeah. So, this is actually correspondence analysis. And who is not familiar with correspondence analysis? Okay. Very amazing few people. So it's a way of representing a matrix like this one that has rows and columns, all in the same sort of geographic space. And 2 items are put next to each other if they have the same profile across all the triads, with the same numbers. And again, let's take 2 of these. These are 2 triads. These 2 triads are near each other because if you correlated their rows, they would be nearly identical. If one's up in winter, the other one's up in winter. The other one's down in winter, that one's down in winter. And seasons are next to triads if in that season that triad is particularly luminous relative to overall custom control. So what you see, in my opinion, is kind of a little movement here that goes from spring to summer to fall. Winter is a little further away from all of it. It's a little different. It's a movement. The pattern of triads that are frequent are different. Over here on the right, you have all of these triads that begin with 0. And if you remember, that's the ones that have no mutual. They don't have reciprocating ties. But when you think about the species, what is a reciprocating tie? It's not nearly as fun as it is with humans. It means that I eat you and you eat me. Often it's adults of one species eat the children of the other. So in summer and spring, you don't see reciprocating ties. Notice that as you go to the left, towards winter, you see ones. Those all have reciprocating ties. And farthest over here is the 210 triad that has 2 reciprocating ties in the triad. It's almost like there's less food available if you go to the left. And people start eating each other, whereas when there's more plentiful, they don't have to do that. I'm not about that's because there are a couple that are duplicated. So here, for example, in terms of the nomenclature, there is one mutual, there's one asymmetric, and there's one null. And that's true in this one too, but it's not the same. So they had to add an extra letter to make it distinguishable. And what did they call that? Let's see. The C was for cycle. This was for a downward tie. This is an upward tie. Okay. So we're still into this idea of how do we measure overall the cohesion of a network. We're just trying to summarize the network as a whole. And one way to do it is to take the average distance. So the average distance here is 2.66. It's a pretty tight network. On average, you can reach any node from any other by a path of around 2.5 meters long. And it might be interesting to also look at the standard deviation. You could have 2 networks that have the same mean, but one has a huge standard deviation. If it had a huge standard deviation, that would suggest that maybe there's 2 groups. Within groups, it's really easy to get places, but then there's a few really long distances that increase the standard deviation. So here is an example of 2 networks. This is CampNet. This is also CampNet in a sense. It's the same number of nodes and the same number of ties. So I made it very similar to the original CampNet. But I used the function in UCI to rewire it at shorter distance. So in the real CampNet, the average distance is 5.3. I rewired it to have a distance of 3.5. And notice that to achieve a low distance, you made it highly centralized. This is a feature of centralized networks, is that they have short distances. And a feature of the funky network is that they have long distance. And that's what led to Watson's program saying, hey, how can we have short distances even though we've got funkiness? We know funkiness means longer distance. And just because it's fun, might provoke you to ask for maybe something added to UCINet in the future. Let's do what I just did there in UCINet. So we're in UCINet. We go to transform, and we find rewire. So we pick rewire. We'll put in, I don't know how well this works with we call it directed data, because there'll be a lot of distances that are impossible. So let's symmetrize it first. So go to transform and choose symmetrize. So transform and symmetrize, and then the input data set's going to change that. The symmetrizing method is going to be maximum. There are a lot of different methods of symmetrizing, but maximum is what we're going to use. What that means is if the tie from A to B is a 1 and the tie from B to A is a 0, we're going to go with the 1. We're going to go with the larger one. And what that really means is that if either one of them report a tie to each other, we're going to say there is a tie. Okay? And the result is going to be called CampNet MaxSim. We can live with that. Say OK. So there's our symmetrized version. I'll close this. And now I'm going to go to transform and rewire. And I'm going to rewire the symmetrized matrix. So rewire, the input data set is CampNet dash max sim with an Y, max sim. I know that's impossible to read, at least by me. CampNet dash max sim. And then it's got, how do you want to rewire it? Do you want to maximize clustering coefficient? Do you want to create a small world, maximize the clustering coefficient, and minimize the distance? Do you just want to minimize the distance? I just want to minimize the distance. So now it's going to run a combinatorial optimization algorithm to try to get a new matrix that has shorter distances, but has the same number of ties and same number of nodes. And there we are. And I don't know if it's the fact that I wrote this program, but it decided that Steve should be the fulcrum of this new network. And that truly is completely accidental. And if I draw that network, I'm going to go to CLI. Well, no, I'm not. I'm going to close that. I'm going to go to this QD button. The QD button. Okay, I'll check that. And then I'll take CampNet maxim min characteristic path length, min distance, and show you what that looks like. You have an extra X in max. 2 X chromosomes, I don't know. There you go. And you see, it gave us a centralized network. So we didn't say, give us a centralized network. We just said, make the distances short, and it finds a centralized network. It's proof of something, I'm sure. Okay. Well, Latin Americans are different. That is so amazing. I think from now on we're going to call you Gary, Michael, and Bert. I'll call myself Steve. That is good, yeah. It's a random process, of course. And what it's discovered is that as long as it puts somebody in the center, it's going to reduce distance. It always yields that structure, but with different people involved. Yeah. Yeah. You know, my computer loves me. It's a good feeling. All right, it's 11:17. Let's take a break. Yeah.
So, because I'm actually collecting data, right? Confidentiality, I guess, is something I've been thinking a lot about. Like, all of the examples you show us have names.
Yes.
And it seems like names are useful, but then what do you tell people? I mean, you just give them numbers? It seems like that would be...
It's, you know, it's all about what you tell them in the consent form.
Right.
So if you tell them it's going to be confidential, then you're going to remove the names and you're just going to have numbers. um, that almost always works best. You collect better data if you guarantee the
Right.
confidentiality. There are some times, though, where the names are really important in consulting projects. The feedback to the organization is really helpful.
Because that's sort of what I want to do, right?
Yeah. And I would tell them that in the consent form that, this is a lighthearted kind of a thing, and it can be illuminating, and it's a lot more useful to you if it does have the names. So, please allow us to use the names.
IRB says you can't tell people that you can guarantee confidentiality, but you can't ever guarantee confidentiality.
Right, you have to tell them what it is that what steps you will take in order to protect the data. And the data will be kept in a locked file drawer and that kind of stuff.
So can you?
Well, and also any like if you do an online survey, there's always the chance that your IP address is going to get linked to it from there.
But you can, like in Qualtrics, you can have like IP address removed.
But still, somewhere.
It was a shock to me that Qualtrics by default gives you the IP address.
Right.
And it told me exactly, because in my class I knew there was one kid who lived in Georgetown, IP address in Georgetown. That's his permit.
So is there a situation where you could give the data to the organization with names, but like if you published it, anonymized, or do you have to be consistent?
Yeah, no.
Do you know what I'm saying?
You can do that, yeah. You just have to be clear, ethically speaking, about who's going to see what.
Right.
Now, in many cases that I've done this in organizations, top management gets to see it with names and nobody else does.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And you also, should promise that this is not part of your evaluation. We're not going to use that one.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So my other question is there a paper that, not like a student paper, but a paper that is sort of exemplary in the kinds of things that you would like in a paper? Do you know what I mean? Because all these things are great, but how you piece them together in a paper in a way that they make sense would maybe be helpful.
Let me find one.
Okay.
But I will forget within 5 minutes, so
So
can you email? Yeah.
But you understand what
I
mean.
do.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Of course, there's many different kinds of things.
Right.
Goals.
Oh, see, I don't like that. Yeah, so there's this guy. I actually met a guy who had studying he hid in a box and he watched people in the box and he go down the store and go through. And the whole thing was different groups of people, how many times they would before they would buy it. And it's not. He kind of had a system there. But I actually, it was printed to me someplace. He presented it, and I asked him about it. Had a little tally. Kind of creepy, Well, the docs do. They're crazy.
Yeah. Okay. So we're mostly here. So let's mostly go on. Our topic is assessing entire networks, getting a single number that summarizes that network. And most of that assessment is how cohesive is it? Some of the assessment will be, what shape is it? Is it clumpy or is it not? Oh, yeah. That reminds me. You don't have to follow along, but I just wanted to show you one other thing in that rewiring thing. So if I take CampNet again, and I go to transform, and I rewire, but this time I tell it that I want to maximize distance, really long paths. And I run it. I get this thing, and then I'll draw it. QD max CPL. Look at that. It's all spread out. Right? And often it'll have lots of little clumps along the way. Like it'll have a clump in the middle and a clump at the end and a clump over there. That's a clumpy network. That's long distances. Okay. Now, going back to here, I said that the average distance was a measure of compactness. It's true. Probably a better one is the average of the reciprocal distances, 1 over d sigma j. For one thing, it means that the bigger the number, the more compact it is, as opposed to remembering that a big number means is bad. The other thing is that when two nodes are completely in separate components and there's no path from one to the other, the distance between them could be regarded as infinite. And so we can then take 1 over infinity as 0. And so we can always calculate this measure even if the network is disconnected. Whereas in the geodesic distance matrix, if there are some nodes that are disconnected, we're just going to have like a missing value somewhere in here. And then how do you sum up a missing value? I don't know what to do with it. So the reciprocal distance works better. And so we call that compactness. And there's another possibility, which is that if you've got a network that's got a lot of separate little parts that are not connected to each other, it's worth measuring fragmentation. So this measure here looks a lot like the measure we just looked at, but the R means that it's a 1 if there is a path from I to J of some length, and it's a 0 if there isn't. So it's just saying how many pairs of nodes can reach each other by some path, no matter how long it is. And it's divided by the number of pairs. So it's the proportion of, so actually the part on the right here is the proportion that can reach each other, and you subtract that from 1, you get the proportion that are fragmented from each other, that you cannot reach from each other. Now, one of the reasons why we care about these kinds of measures is that we might actually be trying to induce fragmentation. So that's what this key player application does. And I think you have key player. We'll see. I think it's downloaded with UCINet. We can try it. So the idea is, suppose you wanted to disrupt the network, and your possibilities, the tools that you have controls over, you could remove somebody, you could isolate them, you could discredit them, you could immunize them if it's a disease network, whatever it is. And then the question is, which ones do you do it to? If we could immunize the entire population, of course we would, but we can't. So who is a priority. And the key player algorithm tries to figure out what's the right combination of k nodes, where k is the most that you can afford to remove, that would maximally fragment the network. And so this is a very old example. This is the 9/11 terrorist network. And so I asked the question, well, which 3 nodes should be isolated in order to maximally disrupt this? If you run this through key player, it says, well, it's these 3 here. And it gives a measure of fragmentation. If I remove them and just look at the picture, you can see it leaves a chunk on the right, a chunk on the left, and then a bunch of isolates. And so it's as effective as can be. In other words, the algorithm tries to find the optimal 3 nodes that could be removed that would maximally damage the network. Or you could have a different kind of goal. I had just mentioned the disrupt net goal. You could try to enhance the network, making it function better. For example, shorter paths that diffuses better coordination, more redundancy in case people are lost. You want to make sure there's another way for information to get there. Or you want to influence the network. You'd like to identify key opinion leaders and then convince them of some new product and then let them diffuse the idea that this is a good product, right, to them. You might want to learn from the network. So you want to figure out who is well positioned in the network to know what's going on. You know, there's certain people that just know. My department, Joe LaBianca is that person. He just knows who's doing what where, okay? So I would definitely have the algorithm find him. We could redirect the network. We might want to prune the network in such a way that redirects the flows towards a different direction, maybe a direction that we are better able to observe, or something like that. Many possibilities that we want to do so this is all in the area of sort of optimizing the networks in some way for some goal. And the point that I want to make is that each of these goals calls for a different set of players. It's not like you just say, oh, you want important people in the network? Run centrality. Doesn't matter why. It does matter why. Different goals require different measures of centrality or optimality. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Can be any number. This program was actually designed for finding what we call peer health advisors in the streets of Hartford, a bunch of drug injectors, and we wanted to diffuse certain practices like bleaching needles, and we could train for 4 days intensively up to 14 people, because that's what we had the grant for. It would give us money for 14 people. So we used the program to find the 14 best people that could then diffuse that out. So it's almost always about money in time. So here's an influence on the same network. So this is the exact same ties, but the goal is who to influence. And the key player solution comes up with one of the same people, Mohammed Atta, but the other 2 are different people. Just pointing out that it's not for a different goal, different metric, different measure. Let's see, yeah, we covered that point. Here's the consulting firm. This was Dr. D. Little, I believe. And the question was, there's going to be a major organizational change. Actually, it resulted in the demise of the company. So who do you get on board with the new change before sort of just rolling it out to everybody? And so the algorithm said, and so in this case, it said, find me 3. And the algorithm picked out that BM, that BS, and that BS. Unfortunately, we used to use the same, we used to use initials for everything. It's really stupid. And actually, I think I'm wrong. Yeah, this is not pointing to BS. That's actually pointing to NP. The arrow just got too long. So I can see here the solution that is BM, BS, and NP. Now, if I had asked for the one best it would have chosen KR, was right in the center of a clump, sort of like eigenvector centrality would have picked that. If I had asked for 2, it would have said BM and BS, which is probably that one and that one. The best 3, BM, BS, and P, bringing in the NP over there, best 5, and so on. But you notice it's not always the same people. Like KR only got used for a few things. They brought it back in for the 5 here. So the right ensemble doesn't always include the single most connected player. The criteria in this one, by the way, was how many nodes can you reach in 2 links? And so you can also see this increase here. In 1 link, KR could reach 31% of the network. In 2 links, that pair could reach 53%. In 3 links, that triple could reach 72%. And you see the increase until it takes 9 people optimally chosen to reach 100% of the network. What's the what? I don't remember. I don't know. Can anybody just look at that picture and go, sturdy? You know those people that they find who like grew up in a closet? They don't have speech or anything, but they have weird mental powers. Like you get them to set the table, and they look at the set of plates, and they just take the right amount, but they can't count. They don't know how to count, but they just take the right amount and put them out. It's like very different capabilities. Yes. Was that too brief to be understood? The sort of idiot savants.
I understood it, but where the origin of it?
There's a lot of these like feral children type of stories where a child is growing up in isolation from humans, and they have very interesting and different abilities. Almost always it's true that they have insensitivity to cold. So they can sleep outside, things like that. But this counting thing is really an interesting one. Because, of course, we know that birds can count quite well, but we don't think that the mechanism is literally a counting mechanism. It's more like a gestalt that's 30, you know. All right. Now that I've been made fun of, I shall move on. And here's the drug injectors. This is what this was designed for. In this case, the question was, which 2 people should be isolated in order to slow the spread of HIV? And a human being could do this. You don't need a computer to figure it out. That just break those 2 links, those 2 chains that separate the African American and the Puerto Rican population. Here's the actual first application, the peer health advisors. And we picked 14 nodes that we could afford that would have the most influence. And then we went back and longitudinally and tried to figure out how much influence they actually had on changing people's behavior. Want to guess what the answer was? They had none. They had not statistically significant. However, their own behavior was significantly changed. So that effort that they went through of learning stuff and then trying to teach others to do it somehow stuck it in their heads, and it became internalized, but it didn't affect their peers. Anyway, so what did we conclude? That kind of peer intervention probably doesn't work. And one reason actually is probably the efficiency of it. If you notice, I picked the 14, right? And it wouldn't be efficient to pick 14 that are clumped with each other. So here's one person there who can reach these people, and here's a person who can reach these people. But notice that means that all of these people that are reached by this one person, they're mostly in contact with other people that have their existing beliefs. And there's the one weird person's trying to say, no, do it this other way. It would actually be better if we did this in clumps. In other words, it's like executive coaching. A guy's an asshole, he doesn't know how to behave with his subordinates and so on. If you just change him and put him back in the same situation, people are still going to expect him to be an asshole. They'll react to him in negative ways. They'll interpret what he's doing as being bad, even though it sounds different. You actually have to do an intervention with his network as well as with himself. So I think that the answer here was we should have done interventions where we have a red one right here, and then, well, what would it be? We have a red one here, and we have a red one here. And so these 2 in the middle are being attacked from both sides by people with the new belief. that seems to go on forever. We don't know why. So can we do this in each area? Let's see. Let's create a data set. Let's take DrugNet, but I'm going to dichotomize it first. So DrugNet is that one which is that we've been looking at with in Hartford. So if you go to Transform and choose Symmetrize and put in DrugNet, and it will create DrugNet-Maxim. Oh crap, how are we going to do this? That may have been a waste of time. Let's see if the program is there. Let me look under Analytic Technologies. ENet. Only ENet, no key player. Okay, it looks like we have to download key player separately, so let's not do that today, but it's a separate program. And one cool thing about it is that it has 3D visuals, so you can change things in three-dimensional space. So, centralization we've more or less covered. I don't want to get into too many details here. Core-periphery I am interested in. I got nothing to work there. The core-periphery structure is one that has periphery, these darker nodes, and a core. And the key characteristic of the core, which this one is not a perfect exemplar of, is that the core better be connected to the other core members. That's part of what it means to be core. Ideally, then you'd have that line there and this line there as well. And the core should also be connected to the periphery, which they are. And the periphery must not be connected to the other periphery. They must only be connected to the core. See, if the periphery were all connected to each other, this would be really two groups. It'd be like the white group and the gray group. But the way it's actually constructed, the gray groups are only connected into the white groups, and the white groups are connected to everybody. That's a core-periphery structure. It's usually associated with some kind of hierarchy, things like that. So how to detect such net? Oh, here's a real one from UCINet. This is probably the Kapfer-Taylor's data. It's a natural core-periphery structure, much more dense in the middle than anywhere else. It doesn't have any other subgroups. How to find them? There's a couple of different ways. There's the discrete, which simply tries to find the core and a periphery and assumes that those are two separate things. Or continuous, which just says, look, there's a degree of coreness that everybody has. Some people are more core than others. Both approaches are nice. So we'll have a look at them both. The categorical approach takes a matrix, and it says the ideal core-periphery structure, if we could sort the people correctly, is that there should be a group that's connected to itself. Everybody in this core is connected to everybody else in it. And there should be a periphery which has no connections at all. And then in this view, it's blank here. It's not zero, and it's not zero here. So in other words, in this definition, we're saying we're agnostic about the ties from the core to the periphery, whatever they turn out to be. All we need is that the periphery be zero and that the core be ones, and if there's something in between for here, that's just fine. So here's an example of one, and this again is probably Kapfer, yep. And so it's basically what it did is that it sorted everybody into lots of different, it would try putting a person in the periphery, then it would try putting it in the core, and it's trying to maximize a measure of fit. And the measure of fit is such that it wants all the ones to be here and all the zeros to be here. And it measures the extent to which that is true. and it doesn't care what's happening in there. And so you can see here, here's the density matrix. So it's 70% of all possible ties are actually present within the core. It's very good. And only 17% of possible ties are actually realized in the periphery. That's a good core periphery structure. Let's see, there's another one here. Sorry? A good one meaning that it conforms to our idealized picture quite well. So let's go back to UCINet. And let's take CampNet Maxim, and let's run Core-periphery on it. So we go to Network, we go to Core-periphery, and we're going to choose the categorical method, because we're still on the categorical approach. The Network, Core-periphery, categorical. The input data set, CampNet dash Maxim with a Y. That's the symmetrized version of CampNet. And actually, Core-periphery handles non-symmetrized data just fine, but for my purposes, I'd rather have it symmetrized. It's a combinatorial optimization algorithm, so it's helpful if there are multiple starts. So I could put in 5 random starts here, or 15, whatever it is. And then it says, what do you want for the density of ties from the core to the periphery? And by default, it's NA. It's like, I don't know. I don't care. You could actually put in something. Like you could say, I want it to be very high density or very low. But we're going to leave it as I don't know. And
tell me again the reason for the number of random starts.
because it's a combinatorial optimization algorithm, there's a random process, and it can't always reach the absolute optimum solution. So if you start it at different places, it's kind of like hill climbing. You might just by chance climb the tallest hill. So it gives it more chances of finding the very best solution, but takes more time. So this is going to take 5 times as much time as just doing one. So the core periphery fit is 0.3992. It's kind of low, especially for small networks. But the core is good. The core is pretty well connected. What's reducing the score is the periphery, which is a little too well connected. Now what happens if we rerun it? I'm going to press Alt backspace. Gets me right back there. And for the desired density for core to periphery, I'm going to put in 1. Trying to put in a 1. And for the other one, a 1. So this means I want really strong ties from the core to the periphery. And I'll run it. And, well, we got a pretty weak core. You know, it really did well on the ties from core to periphery, 0.1942. Let's now run this. I'm going to close this. I'm going to run the same thing. I'm going to press Alt backspace and change the data set to cattail. And I won't change any of the options. So the last one was what, 0.18 or something? This is 0.303. This is a lot better. The next one is 0.322. That's also a lot better. The next one is 0.24. That's not that good. 0.26. That's not that good. But of course, I still got that thing on where it's trying to get really strong ties to the periphery. I could control backspace, Alt backspace, change this back to NA, and run it. 0.48, 0.4, 0.5. Once it gets into like the 0.5s, I consider it a strong core-periphery fit. And this one's 0.5 here. Very nice. Beautiful core. And somewhat okay periphery. Okay, So we know how to do it for the categorical case. Since we're already here, let's do it for the continuous case, and then we'll come back to the slides. So I go to network, I go to Core-periphery, and I choose continuous. And I do not want drugnet, which is definitely in the Core-periphery structure. I will put in cocktail. And let's see. Yeah, unfortunately, this is an old program, and it only did it for the very first matrix in the data set. But it gave us a coreness score for each person, which is very much like a centrality score. It's the extent to which they are in the core, and Chisaconi here is very high, and I bet if we did a map of this, Chisaconi would be right in the center. But Chisaconi has a high score because he's well connected to all the other core players and also connected to peripheral players. Yeah. Coreness is a measure of centrality. It is a special case, and in fact, there's some reason to believe that coreness is a measure of centrality that has a model attached to it, and so should only be applied to networks that have a core-periphery structure. And under those circumstances, when a network has a core-periphery structure, it turns out that coreness and eigenvector centrality are indistinguishable. Other measures like betweenness, they make sense no matter what the structure of the network is. But coreness, it's actually a model of what the overall structure is, and then it says something about the position of each node within that kind of structure. Exactly. Okay, so I am going to quit here because I have other things to do. But you have the slides in here that explains the different approaches. I guess I'll show you one application of it. It's very anecdotal, not to be believed. But it's collected by Jeff Johnson at the South Pole, which is a really great place to collect data because they drop you off in March and they pick you up in October and you can't leave. And so you must interact with everybody else who's there. And in the past, they didn't even have much in the way of communications to the outside world, certainly not personal phone calls, except for emergencies. So they also have a doctor, a physician, who gives everybody a complete physical every month. And the doctor will also administer a network survey if you ask him to. So this is what Jeff Johnson did. And so he's got the network survey for each of the 8 months that the people are down on the South Pole Station. So here are the 8 months. And for each network, you could measure how the fit to the core-periphery structure. I didn't actually show you the fit in the output, but there's a measure that comes out that says, to what degree is this a core-periphery structure? And it's very high for that first month. And it dips then, and then it dips some more, and then it really dips, and then it goes up a bit. And it's interesting that there's also a measure of group morale that the physician administers, and it looks like whatever happens to the network structure is sort of mirrored in group morale a couple of months later. So it did that kind of elbow thing. Then it did the super slide thing, straight slide, which is again mirrored. And then it kind of dips up again. And that's mirrored by, the morale. So the thought is, well, maybe there's something about a core-periphery structure that's good for morale. And of course, the counter arguments are really easy. First of all, it could be group morale that creates core-periphery structures. And it could also be that the conditions of being there for 8 months are such that virtually any kind of measure goes down over time. You just get sick of being there. You get sick of everybody else. Trust goes down, fighting goes up, morale is down. So maybe there's just an underlying third cause that causes both of these lines to go in that direction. There's a million things. But since then, they've collected 16 others of these, and not just in the US South Pole, but in the Russian one and the Polish one. And they've also started collecting things like testosterone levels. And it seems like centrality leads to testosterone, controlling for past testosterone. So it is also the case that testosterone leads to centrality. So there were all men, no, there were not all men in here, but women have testosterone too. And it varies. So it turns out that, yes, testosterone tends to be correlated with centrality, but centrality also tends to produce testosterone, even controlling for the past levels of testosterone. So interesting, results here relating sort of physiological measures to network measures to psychological measures. Now we switch gears and we talk about finding subgroups in data. And the first method that I'm going to show you is what's called factions. And factions is basically extremely simple-minded. It says, give me a network, and then find a partition of nodes that separates them, that exhaustively divides the nodes into mutually exclusive classes. And by the way, you have to tell me how many classes there are. So you tell the program, show me what the best solution would be if I wanted 2 classes, if I wanted 3 classes, 4 classes, and 5, and so on. And so here I asked for the 3-class solution, and as you see, it seems to have found the intuitively correct groupings. How does it do it? It has a measure of fit, and its measure of fit is that it wants lots of ties within a class and few ties between the classes. So it wants lots of intra-red ties and very few ties from red to black or from red to blue. And basically, it randomly swaps people around into different classes until it finds a switch that improves the measure of fit, and then it leaves that one, and then starts swapping other ones, finds one that increases the measure of fit, and so on until it can make no more changes that would improve fit. So here's the actual output, and you can see that when you break up the adjacency matrix and sort it by the groups that it found, that it has this nice block model structure. It has all the ties are in the diagonal blocks, and there's very few ties that are off diagonal. Like here's entirely blank, and then just a couple of straight ties. This is a really good example of a grouped structure. And this slide is basically trying to say that one measure of fitness would be to simply count the errors. So if this is the perfect grouping, and what you actually get is this, that one there shouldn't be there. So that's 1 error. This is 2 errors. That's 3 errors, 4 errors. And the missing 1 there is an error. The missing 1 there is an error. The diagonal ones don't count. The missing 1 there is an error. So you just count up the number of errors, and you find the partition that minimizes the number of errors. Very simple. Yeah. Actually, in the algorithm right now, they are considered their own group and don't do anything special with it. I think it would be probably much better if we just move them out before even analyzing it. It tends to use up a lot of computing time dealing with the stupid isolates. And here you see that when I told it that I wanted 4 groups, it made the 4th group into it's just 1 person, which doesn't match that picture. Yeah, okay, so that picture is the 3-group solution. So, yeah, the 3-cluster solution has 8 errors. The 4-cluster solution has fewer errors. So you could always go to more clusters and have fewer errors until finally you have as many clusters as you have individual nodes, and then there's no errors. But by then, you lost simplicity, right? You no longer have something that reduces the data. And that's part of the reason for finding groups, is that you're trying to do some data reduction. You don't have a model anymore, you have the reality itself. Now, there's a measure called Q. It's also called modularity, that is often used in these cases. It measures the number of ties within groups minus the number of ties that you would expect to be within groups by chance alone, if people were just choosing at random. So it takes into account chance levels and the sizes of groups. So this was invented by a physicist named Mark Newman. Therefore, it's very famous. Here, I would say, I'm not sure why I'm claiming this here, but, well, so Q says that the 3-cluster solution is better than the 4-cluster solution. By the number of errors, the 4-cluster solution is better. Question is, what do you think when you look at this? And I guess when I wrote this slide, I thought, this is a 4-cluster solution. It ought to be. There's a cluster right there. There's a cluster over here. There's a cluster over here. And then there's this 10 that doesn't belong to any group. So I would call that a 4-group solution. I like 6 errors rather than Q. But I have an immense bias against physicists. So take that with a grain of salt. Let's see. Okay. Before we go on to something else, let's run UCINet. And we're going to work with a data set called Zakar. And let's display Zakar, which has a special spelling, Z-A-C-H-A, no, it's not C, it's Z-A-C-K-A-R, sorry, Z-A-C-K-A-R, Zakar. It's, for some reason, somebody thought it was better than Zachary, which is the name of the author of these data. So there's Zakar, and it has a matrix called Zach-E, and it has a matrix called Zach-C. And this is the karate club. Person number 1 is the sensei. Person 34 is the main black belt. And Zach-E is dichotomous socializing ties, and Zach-C is like how often you see people outside of the karate dojo. So we're going to split this into two separate matrices. So I'm going to go to data and do unpack. Data unpack. Data is if I could move this thing, I would. Data is that there. Oh, God. The arrow points completely different place on my screen as it does on that screen. The input data set will be Zakar. We've now learned how to spell. Z-A-C-K-A-R. It says, look, there's 2 files in here. Which ones did you want to extract? We only actually really need the first one. So I'm just going to undo Zach-C. And that's going to extract Zach-E. And it says, yeah, I created Zach-E. Okay. So now I have Zach-E. I'm going to divide it into groups. So I'm going to go to subgroups here, and there's a lot of different methods, and I'm going to choose factions because that's the only one we've talked about so far. And the input data set is going to be Zach-E. I clicked on the sets, correct. So let me go back, tools, subgroups, factions. The input data set is Zache, but now it's with an H, Z-A-C-H-E. And you have to tell it the number of groups. This awkward thing. There's also an additional tab where you can choose different measures to fit. Hamming is the number of errors method, so I guess we could leave it at that. I'll go back to this. I'm just going to run it. And it says that where it says badness of fit, that's literally a count of the number of errors. And it's like 428 errors. It converts it to a percentage correct. So it's got 62% correct. And by correct, it means that this should be all ones up here, and it should be all ones down here, and it should be all zeros over there and all zeros over there. It wants this perfect thing where there are only ties within groups and no ties between. And it's gotten it 61% correct. So that's fine. We could now say, well, what about 3 groups? Maybe 3 groups would work better, because that doesn't look particularly too groupy to me. Well, it kind of does. It actually looks like 2 groups, and each one has a core and a periphery. But let's close this. Let's run it again. I pressed Alt backspace to get back there. I changed the number of blocks to E. I say OK. Now the percentage correct went up from 60, whatever it was, to 75%. So it kind of likes that better, but the question that comes up for us is, yes, but is that a sufficient improvement to warrant going to a more complex view of the network, which is a 3-group view? So we could also go to 4, go to 5, and so on. And it's very much like doing a scree plot and factor analysis and trying to find the elbow of the curve. There's also a number of measures, alternative measures of the quality of a clustering that we can employ, and I'll come back to that.
What's making the difference between the initial proportion correct and final proportion?
The iterations. So it does a cute little algorithm at the beginning that tries to divide it into 3 clusters, and then it starts moving things around, trying to improve that. And eventually, the best it can do, well, is the middle one with 278 errors, and that'll be the one that it chooses as its final. Well, what we're looking for is conformity to the ideal situation, which is that this top block here should be all ones. That means everybody within the group is connected to everybody else. And we want them to have no ties to any other group. That part is pretty good. There's not a lot of ties to other groups. But they're a little shallow in terms of the ties within group. And we want this block to be all ones, and we want this block to be all ones. So where it's failing is in the internal structure of the group. They're just not as dense as we would like them to be. But connections to outside groups is doing pretty well. But in this case, even though the 3-group solution looks like it's better, I happen to know from the ethnographic data that this karate club split into 2. There was a dispute. There was a sort of a cultural dispute in the club. And the dispute was that the sensei saw the karate club as the foundation of your life. And that if you did that well, school would fall into place. Your love life would fall into place. Your health would fall into place. So it was the center. Some of the others, including the main black belt, saw it as an after-school activity to which you could devote some time, but not all of your time. So they ended up splitting into 2. And it's always interesting to see, could we have guessed who went to which group? And we have the data of who went to which group. So let's do this in NetDraw. We can do the clustering in NetDraw itself. So let's just call up NetDraw. So that's the colorful button there with the multiple nodes. So we call up NetDraw. We open Zaki. And I want to point out that unlike CampNet, which has this kind of trivial three-part structure that you don't really need a clustering algorithm to figure out because it's so obvious, this one probably does need a clustering algorithm because it's just not clear. I mean, there's something going on over here on the right, and there's something over here, but it's kind of diffuse. We're now going to bring in, we're now going to do the clustering. If you go to Analysis up here, and choose Subgroups, one of the choices is Factions. So we'll try that. And you know me, I'd go for speed over quality any day. So I'm just going to leave it that way. And number of groups desired, I'm going to leave as 2. And so it says, okay, if you ask me to divide it into 2 groups, this is the best I can do. Now we're going to bring in what really happened. So if I go with the open with an A, that brings in an attribute file. So open with an A. And the attribute file is called, and I know it's bizarre, but it's ZACHATTR. Zach Adder, but spelled with a CH. ZACHATTR. You'll be mumbling this to yourself while you sleep tonight. ZACHATTR. And so that brought the name up here. I will now say OK to ZACHATTR. Little programming. Shouldn't it actually do something? Oh, it's because I had it on. I had the button on the cursor on the screen, but not on my computer. All right, nothing happens. It's over on the right. We choose the Nodes tab and the little drop down. It's got Support, Strength, and Club. Club is what actually happened. And since we're using color to show what the algorithm did, let's use shape to use what actually happened. So click the shape button at the bottom. And if the clustering was accurate, shape and color should combine like in an acid trip. They should be identical, right? You should see blue squares and red circles. What you do, they're mostly red circles, they're mostly blue squares. Are there any errors? Yes, there is number 9 here, who is a blue circle. A mistake. And it's a circle, meaning that 9 actually went with the sensei instead of with the black belt 34. Are there any other errors? Number 10. Number 10, where's 10? 10, okay, here. So yeah, so that one's an error as well. Now 9, I happen to know what the story is. 9 was about to take his exams to go to the next tier of his black belt. And so if he had started over with the new group, he'd have to wait a year to take it. So it was just easier to go with the existing group. But socially, he was more connected to the other side. 10, I don't know anything about, and is not mentioned in the ethnography. And also, I've noticed that other algorithms don't put 10 in that group. Let me try Gervin-Newman here. And I think it's done. Then I'm going to go over and find the Gervin-Newman partitions. Let's find the one that's I must turn off shape. Must turn off shape. Color. Gervin-Newman. See, so that algorithm gets 10 right. It still gets 9 wrong. And 3 wrong. Okay, it's like we can never get just 1 wrong. There are algorithms that can get just 1 wrong. And it's always number 9 in that case. So clustering algorithms are a dime a dozen. And the problem with them is that they all give slightly different answers. What we need probably in a program like this is a wizard that runs 7 of these algorithms and then pulls out like kind of the intersection of them all and says, this is what we were pretty sure about. And then there's certain nodes that are on the literal, the nodes that are on the edge, and depends on the algorithm which one they go with. Whenever things are unclear, different algorithms will give different solutions. But whenever they're clear, like all algorithms will say that 33 and 34 are in the same group. No algorithm screws that up. Oh, I don't think so, but I have the paper where he talks about the individuals. So I'll have to look at that. Yeah, I doubt if he stuck around very long, but he might have something to say, like if the new group might have collapsed in the next couple of months.
I don't even mean like the actual group of the.
Yeah.
I mean like with their lives, like work and school.
I guarantee he did not follow these for 20 years, but that would be wonderful. Okay, we have 16 minutes. I mean, we got tons of time. So, I'm going to leave that open. I'm going to go to the slides. And talk about Johnson's hierarchical clustering, which is kind of a generic form of clustering. It ends up being used by many other clustering algorithms as kind of a shell, as a technique. So I'll show it to you with some data that's not network data, and then we'll get back to network data. So here are what I call the cities data. They're in UCINet. And these are driving distances between US cities. And those of you who took my research methods class have seen this before. Here is a multidimensional scaling picture of these data. And the multidimensional scaling picture knows that New York is supposed to be close to Boston and that Boston's a little further away from DC, but it has no idea about human conventions as to what's north, south, east, and west. So it puts Miami at the top and so on. But the pattern is right. The relative relationships are all right. Here is a hierarchical clustering that we are about to do, and this is called a dendrogram. This is an old-fashioned dendrogram that used to be made by line printers, hitting X's, right? But I find them the most easy to read. So what the algorithm does is that it searches the entire distance matrix and finds the one distance that's shorter than all the others. And the smallest distance is 206, which is Boston to New York. So what it does is that it puts Boston and New York into the same clump. It collapses them. So initially, everybody's in their own cluster. And now, for the first time, it clusters 2 points. And you can tell that they're clustered together because there's an X between them. That's the link between them. And what level were they clustered at? 206. That's the distance between them. So that tells you kind of the internal cohesion of that cluster. So once it's clustered them together, it now has to create a new distance matrix that reflects a different set of objects, because Boston and New York are no longer distinct objects. They're one thing called Bosnia. And it's got to work out, well, what's the distance of Bosnia to DC? Because Boston was 429 and New York was 233. What is the distance of the combined object? And there's some obvious possibilities. You could average the two. You could take the smaller of the two. You could take the larger of the two. The example I'm using is going to use the smaller of the two. So the distance from Bosnia to DC is going to be 233. And the distance from Bosnia to Miami is going to be 1308. So let's see in the next slide. That row has been collapsed. Bosnia to DC is 233. Bosnia to Miami is 1308. And it did that for all of those and copied it down the column as well. So now we have a new distance matrix with one less object. And we run through the same thing. We ask, what's the shortest distance? Could be 379, but no, it's 233. between DC and Bosnia. So there's Bosnia, and DC is obviously right next to that object. So it says, let's combine Bosnia with DC. And you can see that in the dendrogram, there's an X between DC and Boston and New York. So they're all clustered together. Now it's got to figure out what is the distance of Bosnia, DC, this northeastern cosmopolitan thing, to all the others. And we're using the rule that it's the shortest distance. So, for example, in the case of Seattle, the DC was 2684, Bosnia was 2815. So we're going to say that the combined distance is 2684 because it's a smaller number. So we create the new matrix with Bosnia DC as a single object, 2684 is the distance to Seattle, and you can see it's an amoeba that's spreading out from the northeastern seaboard there. We do this now. The next time, now this time we search through this thing, find the smallest value. Now it's the 379 between LA and San Francisco. So it's going to join LA and San Francisco up there, and in the dendrogram we see a link between those two, LA and San Francisco. And so in the next picture, we see that we've got Bosnia DC and we've got SFLA as two new objects. And the distance from SFLA to all these others was the minimum of the distance from San Francisco or LA. So we're starting to develop this western side here. Let's go a little further. The east side now pulls in Chicago. And then the next bit, the west coast pulls in Seattle. And then the next bit, the east pulls in Denver. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the US, that is an odd choice. People tend to think of Denver as being out west, at least we do out here. But why did it do it? It did it because, going back here, if you look at the distances, the smallest distance in the matrix was Denver to this thing, to the Eastern Metropolitan Amoeba. Because we're using the shortest distance, Denver to Chicago is not very far, so it's going to get stuck in with Chicago. Had we been using the average distance, then Denver to the average of all these would have been much further and wouldn't have made this, quote, mistake. But instead, it grabbed in Denver. So now we've got a situation here where we've got, we have a west coast, which is here. We've got an east coast, which is here. Denver got sucked in, and Miami is by itself. And of course, in the next moment, it's going to suck in all of the United States except for Miami, because they speak a different language. And finally, we get to everybody together, which I don't even show. So everybody get that basic process clustering? Okay. It's 1221. So if we wanted to apply this hierarchical clustering to network data, we would need data set that will look like the city's data set. We would need something that has values, because ones and zeros would have been too many ties. There's just no discrimination there. So one obvious thing is to convert the data to geodesic distances and then cluster that. That would be fine. If we did that, we would get this here. And notice that at the very bottom, everybody's together. We're all one cluster. Right above that is the two-cluster solution. And the two-cluster solution is the men's participants, the women participants. They're all in one big cluster. And then over here is the instructors clique, along with the two teachers' pets, right? The groupies. And then at the third level here is a three-group solution, and that's the three-group solution we're used to seeing. We're used to seeing. It's this one, the women, and then the men up there, and onward. Now, this is called Newman community detection. It's basically like a hierarchical clustering, but instead of looking for the pair that is the least distant, what it does is that it has the measure Q. It has that modularity Q, which is a measure of the extent to which a cluster has ties within, but few ties between clusters. And it says, at any given point in the algorithm, it says, where could I put this node such that it would increase my Q? And it figures out that, well, it would be cluster 3, and then it puts it in there. And then it goes on again and says, okay, now, for each node, where could I move it that would increase my Q? And it ends up doing a hierarchical clustering. And its Q maximizes here at the 3 cluster solution, which is the one that kind of arbitrarily puts 10 in here. 10 could have easily gone in with the blue group, could have easily gone in with this one. They would all yield the same Q statistic, but by chance alone, it was 10 that got put in here. The 4 cluster solution is the one that has 10 by itself. I actually prefer that, but the Q statistic is not quite as high. Still, it's up to the researcher to decide how many clusters are they going to use. What makes sense intuitively, what correlates with other parts of the data, and what represents the right level of complexity versus simplicity. It could be that this one up here had a very high Q, except that it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 clusters, which is just not sensible in a network that has 10 nodes. Too complicated. So we tend to favor something that has 3 or 4. Finally, I'm going to introduce the Louvain method. This is currently the most popular method out there because it does translate fairly well to large networks. And it was invented by computer scientists who, in my estimation, are better than physicists. So I don't mind this method, and it's in UCI now. I just have my preferences. So you start with every node in each cluster. So that's just like hierarchical clustering. Then it has a stage 1 and a stage 2. Stage 1 is just like Newman community detection. For each node I, it examines each of their neighbors j and says, if I move I into j's cluster, would it increase my Q? And it tests it for each neighbor. And if it finds one that will actually increase its Q, it will move I into the neighbor's cluster. And then it will repeat. And it'll go through every node I and say, let me look at its neighbors. Would it be better if I moved into neighbor J? Would it be better if I moved into neighbor K's group? Until it can no longer move anywhere and increase Q. At that stage, it does something interesting. At that stage, it collapses all the nodes within a cluster into a single supernode. And then any ties that that supernode has to other nodes get summed up. So let's repeat. Let me show this bigger here. Here's the original network. Stage 1 ended up finding 4 clusters, a red cluster, a green cluster, a blue, and a light blue. Now it's going to say, okay, all these blues, they are going to become a single node. And these light blues are going to become a single node. And the tie from the dark blue to the light blue is going to be equal to the number of ties that go between them. And as you can see, there's only one tie that goes between them. So here we have the blue supernode and the lighter supernode, and there's strength of tie 1 because there's only one tie between them. The greens now are all collapsed, and the blues are all collapsed. So how many ties are there between those two groups? Well, I see 1, 2, 3, 4. There are 4 ties between those. That's the strength of tie here. Let's see. And you may wonder what what the 14 and the 4 are, those are the number of ties within the groups, although they're multiplied by 2 because it considers each edge as 2 directed edges. So from 13 to 11 is 1, and from 11 to 13 is 2. And so there's 2 within the light blue group there. It now treats the smaller network as just a regular network, and it goes through the same hierarchical clustering process to find who can I collapse. And it ends up finding that it collapses those 2 together and these 2 together to get this final network over here. And it just keeps doing that. This method works really well. The only problem with it is that it never reaches a really simple solution. So if I were to give it, let's see, the drug net one, that to any human eye has, yeah, this one here, any human eye kind of says, look, there's 2 groups. This is one thing over here, and this other thing over here. There's some noise in there, some noise over there. It will never find that. The closest it comes is it says that there's 13 groups. So anyway, I guess bottom line is there are a lot of these different clustering algorithms for networks. Almost all of them are based on the idea of partitioning into mutually exclusive groups, which may not correspond to substantively the truths. Right? Most people do belong to multiple groups. They also disagree with each other, so you have to run multiple ones and try to find, well, what's true in all of them. And I think that whenever possible, it's better to rely on the raw data of how connected people are to each other rather than a highly manipulated result, which is these artificial clusters. So I would rather not cluster the data and then use the cluster ID as an independent variable. I'd rather somehow use the raw, how many links are there that separate each pair of people or something like that. But we'll pick up more about that in 3 classes. Next week spring break. Okay. So, and the week after that, we are doing the hardest thing of the semester, and that is ergom. And the idea of ergom is to predict ties. It's like to look at a network like that and say, why is there a tie between those 2, but not a tie between those? How can we predict the pattern of ties? And it's highly statistical. If you want to review statistics first, that would be a good idea, particularly if you review maximum likelihood methods. Okay, see you in 2 weeks, if I'm still alive. Actually, still deciding, because one of the guys in our group definitely doesn't want to go, right? My father is 94. He's like, I'll go. I'm going to die anyway. Yeah.
Simon 445.
I sent you an email about the paper.
Oh, okay. Great.